So Venerable Children and I just returned from her 4-week teaching tour in Taipei, Malaysia and Singapore this year. And one of the questions that I thought a lot about, but many thoughts are still half-baked, is the whole question of what is a Buddhist education? I mean, how do you even begin to organize and plan a journey that ends over many lifetimes in Buddhahood? Yeah, how do you even wrap your head around something like that? So these are just some thoughts and observations from the trip. And Venerable, please feel free to correct and jump in and add on as you wish. So when we were in Taipei, we spent most of our time with communities of fully ordained nuns. And from what I observed, it seemed that for most Buddhist monastics in Taiwan, they start their education with 4 years in a Buddhist institute or Buddhist college. So those are not accredited by the state as like a formal degree program, but I guess they have their own ways of running within the own systems of governance. Yeah. So you can do 4 years of formal Buddhist study. Some people go on to do master's degrees or PhDs in those institutions. And then after that, you go back to your community where you live and practice and serve together with usually a community of monastics if you're living in one. And you join the rotas, you cook for 2 weeks at a time, or you're sent to the garden and so on. So some challenges we saw with this system, for sure, is that transition point, right? If you spend a lot of your early monastic life studying in a Buddhist institution, doing formal academic study, it can be a challenge to go back into community life. So we met some monastics who were at that transition point, from finishing their master's thesis now having to figure out how to work in the garden. So that's one challenge of a system like that. And also we saw that sometimes, Venerable kept saying, well, does this mean that your study ends after the 4 to 7 years you spend at a Buddhist institute, right? It can look like that, right? Because that's the formal piece. Did it end? Yeah, and I think one challenge the monastics face then is how to continue to keep up your systematic studies during your own personal study time amidst all the things that you do at a monastery. If you live at a monastery where there are no teachings being given regularly, that can kind of fall off the plate. One of the nuns I talked to did say, they were kind of left on their own to decide what they wanted to focus on. They would tell their teacher, but she felt that her study was quite piecemeal after the years of formal education. Like left on her own, she felt she was, she studied what she was interested in at different times, but there was no overarching structure. The way that we have it, say, if you follow the Lam Rim over time. We were just comparing the approaches in Tibetan Buddhist education and the Chinese Buddhist education system. But in any case, I saw very much that the role of the abbess or the spiritual teacher of the monastery is really key in keeping the community together and integrating people into the community. There were many times I got to observe teachings in the moment in the kitchen, or those are the teachings that your teacher gives based on whatever's happening there and then to work with the afflictions. So for sure, the abbesses in Chinese monasteries are well known for being very fierce. Like half their job seems to be yelling at people with kindness, but really it's pointing out your faults. Yeah, one day I remember I was helping to get Venerable's breakfast, and then there was like a small discussion about the frying of tofu in that corner. And then later on when I was at breakfast, the abbess turned it into a whole teaching about mindfulness while cooking, and how it's important to integrate your daily activities into your practice. And she was also admonishing the nun that hadn't followed her instruction about frying tofu, I think. So who looked like she was going to lose her appetite at breakfast. So, it was just nice to see that across monastic communities, I think the training is in common that way, where you live together and practice together and your teacher points out your faults constantly. And of course, a big piece of the training is to watch your mind and your afflictions that come up. That's what many of the nuns said, that it's about you learning to look inward again and again as you live and practice in community. So one other point of interest was when we talked to the nuns from Dharma Drum. They actually have a 2-tier system, it seems. So one group of monastics who are under the age of 35, they do the 4-year Buddhist college system. They have a Sangha college. And those who are above 35 do those courses part-time, but they go directly into service. Yeah. yeah, you do the courses part-time, but there's a lot more focus on service. So I asked why. So one part of their thinking is that if you ordain older, I think their age limit is 40 or something like that. So if you ordain older, you must have had many obstacles in life. So you have to purify those obstacles and create merit by offering service. That's one piece. Also, it's to help you understand how Sangha community life functions. I think one of the nuns I met said she felt like if you go straight into service and you see how the Sangha operates, it becomes quite clear whether this life is for you or not. So if people who are older, if they ordain older, they don't waste time if there's not a good fit. I mean, something like that. Yeah. But really, it seemed like the big piece was the need to make merit and offer service, especially if you had a lot of habits from working life and your own opinions. So that was seen as an important part of the training. Of course, that's just the choices that one Sangha makes about how they want to organize themselves. They pointed out that some Sanghas too focus on ordaining older people. And so, they have an entirely different focus and will deploy their monastics differently. So in Taipei, we got to witness Buddhist education for monastics that way. Another organization that I found quite remarkable was when we were in Kuala Lumpur, we went to Nalanda Buddhist Society. So they are primarily focused on lay Buddhist education. And from what I observed, it seemed they had a founder who was very learned and who was leading by example. We didn't spend much time with him, but just hearing from the people who had worked and studied with him over time, that he had put a lot of energy into building a strong core team over a period of about 10 years. I mean, the idea of a small team is 104 members. Yeah. But, they weren't focused on, say, growing in terms of numbers or having wide outreach. They really wanted to develop a good education system and retain people who were committed to their study program. What I was impressed by was that many of them said, oh, we don't have many teachers. The idea of being a teacher is one that's held with a lot of care. They saw themselves as facilitators, just there to share the Dharma. So they were always in the process of learning, is what they kept emphasizing. And they had Pali Sutta studies that were structured. They had Buddhist studies programs as well. And what I was very touched to see was their youth outreach. We met a team of young people who were about to go off to train volunteers and I think lead camps for elementary school students, about 200 something elementary school students in different parts of Malaysia. So you had these teenagers who were like super enthusiastic about going out to share the Dharma. And there was like a flag bearing ceremony. We didn't see this, but we heard about it, where they would receive the Buddhist flag and also the organization's flag. And it gave them a sense of being ambassadors and ownership. They said it was always a very moving experience for the young people. It's like, oh, the Dharma is in our hands, and we have to try and be good role models and go out and share that. Yeah, in general, the youth movement in Malaysia, I think, was very inspiring. And maybe I'll share about this in a different BBC, because one interesting discovery was that the roots of the Buddhist youth movement in Malaysia come about through an American monk who grew up in Alabama during the Jim Crow period, who was his whole family. He came from a lineage of Protestant ministers, where the eldest son in the family all became Protestant ministers except him. And he became a Buddhist monk and traveled the world. And he was instrumental in establishing the youth movement in Malaysia. So they still memorialize him in their Buddhist museums and talk about him very fondly. So it's really remarkable, the effect of this one person on the development of Buddhism in this whole country, that the effect is still seen. So I'm researching his biography and we'll share more. Along the way, we also met students who were facing challenges, which I think, on the flip side, it shows you what does and doesn't work, I guess. On the one hand, we met students who were doing Buddhist studies at an academic institution, but they were really struggling because they weren't getting spiritual guidance. And one thing that struck me was that, there are Buddhist organizations that try and start secular humanist universities. Then you kind of get into an identity crisis, I think, because of your prominence as a Buddhist organization, you draw people who are looking for spiritual guidance, for some kind of spiritual development, but you're trying to be an academic institution. So you're caught in this double bind. And so the students we met were coming to the end of their master's or PhD programs and really wondering, what next? Like, I don't have a teacher, like, and I'm not really in this for the job prospects. I mean, I took time off to study Buddhism really to transform my mind. What do I do with this now? So that was quite painful actually to see and hear. We also met students who met regularly to go through very complex highest yoga tantra sadhanas, but they had no understanding of the basic teachings. And I think that's symptomatic. Oh yes, no understanding of the sadhanas. Yeah, which I think points to a problem that Venerable has observed in Asia and probably in other places too, where often, very famous, eminent high lamas are invited to a place for short times. They give a lot of initiations, empowerments. That's what draws the crowds. But then there's no Dharma teaching. Or, and the group will say, well, if we invite them to do the Dharma teachings, nobody comes. And then, so you wind up in this situation where all these people are getting initiations without being prepared. And all the people are lost, yeah. That was also quite shocking for me to see firsthand. I mean, I heard about it from Venerable, but to have so much faith and earnestness and wanting to practice and connect. And they were asking, like, yeah, what's going on? I don't know what practice I'm actually doing and what it means. Okay. And also in Singapore, and I think this is a problem that's been there for a long time, the centers are well aware of, that they often host many visiting teachers, but there are not many places with structured long-term study programs. Yeah, is what many of the centers we went to said. So, a lot of people come through Singapore here and there, but nobody really wants to stay there and teach for a long time, it seems. Nonetheless, it was quite inspiring how much was happening at one time in this. It's not a Buddhist country, but I know one night when Venerable was giving a talk, at the same time there was like a Buddhist concert at the place where we were staying. Across the street there was a fire puja, so all these things happening in the Buddhist community to bring people together. But at the same time, you see that people are not necessarily coming together to study regularly over time. So, that's another issue. So anyhow, reflecting on some of these things that we saw, the main takeaway I have is that really having a qualified spiritual mentor is extremely important, difficult to find, really the foundation of all good qualities. That's like the root of your practice, the center, Also having a community to practice with, a healthy community, a community that's actually putting the Dharma into practice is also extremely important and rare. And I think that's where you can see too, so many times we've seen the 8 worldly concerns or afflictions come up in communities, and that's when you get to see whether people are actually putting the Dharma into practice. So to have a community that supports the practice is also very rare. And then also having sustained teachings over many lifetimes, I think is really key. And what I've come to really appreciate is just the time that we have here at the Abbey to digest the teachings, to meditate on them, to try and integrate them into our daily life. I guess I've been reflecting on this because as a former high school teacher, I am I'm allured by the illusion of structured education. We were so trained to, this is a 4-year program with these outcomes, then you work backwards and see what leads up to that. And then at the end of 4 years, you get a piece of paper, that's it, right? And then sometimes when you come into a structure that's totally different, it's like, where are the signposts? What next? So that's been very nice to come and just from living here, seeing that I think we have a really excellent Dharma program in place. And it's not something to take for granted. So may we keep creating the causes to sustain the Dharma here at Sravasti Abbey.